It was a typical busy day in the city, with firefighters and police officers working tirelessly to keep everyone safe. Michelle Carter, a dedicated firefighter, had just finished a long and exhausting shift. Earlier that day, she had helped extinguish a dangerous fire in a residential building, saving several families. Her face was streaked with soot, her uniform slightly torn, but her spirit remained strong. After ensuring the fire scene was secure, Michelle walked to a quiet alley to catch her breath. She leaned against the brick wall, her face tattoos, symbols of her personal struggles and victories, visible against her dark skin. To Michelle, the tattoos were a reminder of how far she had come in life, a badge of resilience she wore proudly. As Michelle rested, Officer Daniels, a young police officer patrolling the area, noticed her. Daniels had recently joined the force and was eager to make a name for himself. When he saw Michelle, he didn't recognize her as a firefighter. Instead, he fixated on her tattoos and assumed the worst. To him, the tattoos were a sign of trouble, and he approached her with an aggressive tone. "Hey you," Daniels called out, walking toward her. "What are you doing here? This is no place to hang around." Michelle looked up, surprised. "I'm just resting," she replied calmly. "I'm a firefighter. I just finished a call." Daniels didn't believe her. To him, the tattoos overshadowed everything else. "Firefighter? You don't look like one. Where's your ID?" he demanded. Michelle sighed and reached for her badge, clipped to her uniform. But Daniels didn't wait. Assuming she was reaching for something dangerous, he grabbed her arm. "Don't make any sudden moves," he shouted. "Wait, I'm just showing you my badge." Michelle protested, trying to pull her arm free. The situation escalated quickly. Daniels, convinced she was a threat, didn't take a moment to assess the situation. Instead, he acted out of fear and bias. Without thinking, he swung his fist, hitting Michelle on the side of her face. She stumbled back, her head hitting the brick wall behind her. A few bystanders who had been walking by stopped in shock. One of them pulled out a phone and started recording. "What are you doing?" "She's a firefighter," someone yelled. Michelle, dazed and in pain, managed to steady herself. "I told you, I'm not a threat," she said, her voice firm despite the circumstances. Realizing he was being watched, Daniel stepped back, but his expression was still defensive. "I thought you were," he began, but he didn't finish his sentence. Michelle's firefighter colleagues, who had been packing up nearby, rushed to the scene when they heard the commotion. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. "She's one of us." Daniels froze as the truth began to sink in. He had just assaulted a firefighter, a woman who had risked her life earlier that day to save others. The growing crowd stared at him, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. Meanwhile, the bystanders' video had already started spreading online. Within minutes, the clip of the confrontation was being shared on social media, sparking outrage. People were horrified by the way Michelle had been treated, and the hashtags #JusticeForMichelle and #RespectFirefighters began trending. As Michelle's colleagues helped her to her feet, she looked Daniels in the eye. "You didn't even stop to listen," she said quietly. Daniels didn't respond. He knew he had made a mistake, but it was too late to take it back. The incident had set off a chain of events that would soon spiral far beyond the alley. For Michelle, this was just the beginning of a fight for justice and respect, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been judged unfairly. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, the video recorded by a bystander had gone viral, showing Michelle Carter, a respected firefighter, being unjustly confronted and punched by Officer Daniels. Social media erupted with outrage. People from all walks of life expressed their shock and anger at how Michelle had been treated. Hashtags like #JusticeForMichelle and #StopTheBS dominated the online conversation. Michelle sat at home, nursing a sore cheek and a heavy heart. Her close friends and firefighter colleagues had rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. She hadn't wanted to become the center of attention, but now her story was out there. The weight of it all felt overwhelming. Her father, Anthony Carter, arrived that evening. Anthony wasn't just a regular dad. He was a man with influence and authority, the head of the city's police oversight board. When he saw Michelle's bruised face, his heart sank. "Michelle, what happened to you should never have happened to anyone," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're going to make sure this doesn't get brushed under the rug." Michelle nodded. "I just want people to understand that we shouldn't judge others by how they look," she said. "I've worked hard to be where I am. My tattoos tell my story, but they don't define me." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels faced mounting pressure. The video had placed him in the spotlight, and it wasn't a good look. His superiors at the police department called him in for a meeting to address the incident. Daniels tried to defend his actions, saying, "I thought she was a threat. Those tattoos made me think she was part of a gang." The police chief wasn't impressed. "Daniels, you didn't assess the situation. You acted on an assumption, and now the entire department is under fire because of your mistake," the chief said sternly. Daniels was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. As the days passed, protests erupted in front of the police station. People carried signs that read, "Respect our firefighters," and "End bias in policing." The community's frustration was palpable, and it wasn't just about Michelle. It was about a larger issue of unfair treatment and bias that many had experienced. At the same time, Michelle's story began to inspire others. People shared their own experiences of being judged based on appearances. Local news outlets interviewed her, and she spoke calmly and thoughtfully about the need for change. "I don't want revenge," she told a reporter. "I want understanding. I want people to take a moment to listen before they act." Anthony Carter, meanwhile, was hard at work. He met with the police chief and other city leaders, demanding accountability and transparency in the investigation. As head of the police oversight board, he knew the importance of handling the situation properly. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said in a public statement. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what she did." The investigation into Daniel's actions progressed, and more details came to light. It wasn't the first time he had acted aggressively based on assumptions. Past complaints from citizens were uncovered, showing a pattern of behavior that painted a troubling picture. As the city buzzed with conversations about Michelle's case, she tried to maintain her focus. She continued her work as a firefighter, though the physical and emotional pain lingered. Her colleagues treated her with extra care, knowing the burden she carried. "You're one of the strongest people I know," one of them told her. "This city is lucky to have you." Despite everything, Michelle refused to let the incident define her. She knew she had a platform now, a chance to make a difference. With her father's support and the backing of the community, she prepared herself for the fight ahead. The road to justice wouldn't be easy, but Michelle was determined to see it through. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. As days turned into weeks, Michelle's story remained a hot topic in the city. People across the community were rallying behind her, demanding answers and justice. News reporters covered every development, and Michelle's name became synonymous with strength and resilience. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Daniels' actions was in full swing. The Police Oversight Board, led by Michelle's father, Anthony Carter, was determined to leave no stone unturned. Anthony, known for his fair and thorough approach, worked tirelessly with his team to piece together what had happened. He reviewed witness statements, video footage, and Daniels' record, which revealed a troubling history of complaints about bias and unprofessional behavior. One evening, Anthony visited Michelle at her home. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going through a stack of letters sent by strangers who had been inspired by her courage. "Dad, look at this," she said, holding up a letter. "It's from a young girl who says she wants to become a firefighter because of me." Anthony smiled, but his face quickly turned serious. "You've touched a lot of lives, Michelle. But this fight isn't over. Daniels has a history of complaints that were ignored. We need to make sure this investigation leads to real change, not just a slap on the wrist. Michelle nodded. I don't want him to lose his job if he can learn from this, but I do want him, and everyone, to see that assumptions can hurt people. While Michelle focused on sharing her message with the community, Daniels was struggling to defend himself. His lawyer argued that his actions were a mistake made in the heat of the moment, but the evidence against him was mounting. The video footage clearly showed that Michelle was in her firefighter uniform when the incident occurred, and Daniels' quick judgment had caused unnecessary harm. Public opinion wasn't on Daniels' side either. As the video continued to circulate, more people came forward to share their own experiences of being judged unfairly. Community forums and town hall meetings were held, where residents voiced their frustrations with systemic bias and demanded reforms. At one of these meetings, Michelle chose to speak. Dressed in her firefighter uniform, she stood before a room full of people, her voice steady and calm. I'm not here to attack anyone, she began. I'm here to talk about understanding. What happened to me could happen to anyone. And it's not just about me. It's about all of us working together to build a community where we see each other for who we really are. Her words resonated deeply, and the crowd gave her a standing ovation. Even those who had been skeptical at first couldn't deny the sincerity and wisdom in her message. At the same time, Anthony was meeting with city officials to discuss broader reforms. This isn't just about one officer, he said firmly. It's about addressing the culture that allows these incidents to happen. We need better training, more accountability, and a commitment to fairness. Behind the scenes, Anthony and his team were preparing for the upcoming hearing, where the findings of the investigation would be presented. They had gathered enough evidence to show that Daniels' actions were part of a larger problem, not just an isolated incident. For Michelle, the days were long and emotionally draining, but she stayed focused on her work as a firefighter. Her colleagues supported her every step of the way, reminding her that she was more than the incident that had thrust her into the spotlight. You're a hero, Michelle, one of them told her during a quiet moment at the station. Don't let anyone take that away from you. As the hearing approached, the city was buzzing with anticipation. Would justice be served? Would real change come from this? Michelle and her father knew the stakes were high, but they were ready to face whatever came next. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for a better future for everyone. The day of the hearing finally arrived. The city council chambers were packed with reporters, community members, and supporters of Michelle Carter. The atmosphere was tense yet hopeful. People wanted justice, not just for Michelle, but for everyone who had experienced unfair treatment. Michelle sat at the front of the room with her father, Anthony Carter, by her side. She wore her firefighter uniform, a symbol of her dedication to serving her community. Despite the visible scar on her cheek, she held her head high, her expression calm and resolute. Officer Daniels entered the room with his lawyer. His face was pale, and he avoided making eye contact with anyone. He knew he was facing not only Michelle, but the entire community demanding accountability. The hearing began with opening statements. Anthony Carter, as head of the Police Oversight Board, addressed the room first. His voice was steady and firm as he outlined the purpose of the hearing. This is not just about one incident, he said. This is about ensuring fairness, accountability, and trust between law enforcement and the community. We are here to uncover the truth and take the necessary steps to prevent incidents like this from happening again. The first witness was a bystander who had recorded the incident on their phone. The video was played for everyone in the room to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage showed Daniel striking Michelle without provocation. The bystander described what they had witnessed that day, emphasizing how Michelle had tried to explain herself but was ignored. Next, Michelle took the stand. She spoke clearly and calmly, recounting the events of that day. I've dedicated my life to serving and protecting this city, she said. But in that moment I was judged, not for who I am, but for how I look. I wasn't given a chance to explain myself. I was assumed to be a threat. Her words resonated deeply with everyone in the room. Some wiped away tears, moved by her courage. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing their own experiences in her story. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer argued that the officer had acted out of fear, claiming he had misinterpreted the situation. "My client regrets his actions and understands that he made a mistake," the lawyer said. But Anthony Carter wasn't convinced. He presented evidence of Daniel's previous complaints, showing a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. "This isn't just about one bad decision," Anthony said. "This is about a mindset that needs to change." The hearing lasted for hours, with both sides presenting their arguments. The police chief spoke as well, acknowledging that the department needed to do better. "We failed Michelle, and we failed our community," he admitted. "We are committed to making changes to rebuild trust." As the day came to an end, the Oversight Board announced that they would deliberate overnight before making their decision. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy in the room remained palpable. People were hopeful that justice would be served. Outside the chambers, Michelle and Anthony stood together, surrounded by supporters. "You were incredible in there," Anthony told his daughter. "I just told the truth," Michelle replied. "I hope it's enough to make a difference." That evening, as they waited for the board's decision, Michelle reflected on how far they had come. She knew this fight wasn't just about her. It was about creating a future where no one else would have to endure what she had experienced. The following morning, the city council chambers were once again filled with people eagerly awaiting the Oversight Board's decision. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Michelle sat next to her father, Anthony Carter, who had spent the night reviewing every detail of the case to ensure justice would be served. Before the meeting began, Michelle noticed people in the audience holding signs of support, some reading "We stand with Michelle" and "Justice for all." The show of solidarity gave her a sense of hope and strength. She took a deep breath, preparing for whatever was to come. Anthony opened the session with a statement. "Yesterday we heard compelling testimonies and saw undeniable evidence of misconduct. Today we will present our decision, but let me be clear. This is not just about consequences for one person. This is about ensuring that our community feels safe, respected, and valued." Officer Daniels sat with his lawyer, looking visibly nervous. He had spent the night considering his actions and the possibility of losing his badge. For the first time, he realized the gravity of what he had done, not just to Michelle, but to the entire community. The Oversight Board members took turns reading their findings. They started by addressing Daniels' actions on the day of the incident. "Officer Daniels acted without proper assessment of the situation," one member stated. "He allowed his biases to cloud his judgment, leading to the unjust assault of a firefighter who was actively serving her community." The board also presented their review of Daniels' past complaints. "This is not an isolated incident," another member added. "Officer Daniels has shown a pattern of behavior that raises serious concerns about his ability to serve as a fair and effective member of law enforcement." When the board finished presenting their findings, they announced their decision. Daniels would be suspended without pay and required to undergo extensive bias training and counseling. Furthermore, the police department would implement mandatory training for all officers to address implicit bias and ensure better interactions with the community. The room erupted in applause. While some had hoped for harsher consequences for Daniels, most agreed that the decision was a step in the right direction. It wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about making systemic changes to prevent future incidents. Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. Justice had been served, and the outcome reflected the need for accountability and reform. As she looked at the crowd, she saw faces filled with hope and determination. This was more than her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been judged unfairly. After the hearing, Michelle and Anthony held a press conference. Reporters swarmed them with questions, but Michelle remained poised and confident. "I'm not here to celebrate someone's punishment," she said. "I'm here to celebrate progress. This decision shows that when we speak up, we can make a difference. I hope this inspires others to stand up for what's right." Anthony added, "This is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do, but today proves that change is possible when we come together as a community." Meanwhile, Daniels quietly left the chambers. Though the decision had been difficult to hear, he knew it was fair. He had a long road ahead to rebuild his reputation and regain the trust of his colleagues and the community. As the day came to an end, Michelle returned to the fire station. Her colleagues greeted her with cheers and hugs, proud of her courage and resilience. One of them handed her a small card that read, "You are a hero, on and off the field." Michelle smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't over, but she knew she had the strength to continue. With the support of her father, her colleagues, and the community, she was ready to keep moving forward. The board's decision quickly made headlines across the city, sparking conversations far beyond the council chambers. News outlets praised the outcome as a step toward accountability and systemic reform. Social media was buzzing with posts celebrating Michelle Carter's courage and the community's role in bringing about change. At home, Michelle read through the countless messages she had received. People from all over the country were reaching out to thank her for standing up and sharing her story. Some were firefighters, police officers, and first responders who resonated with her experiences. Others were ordinary citizens who felt inspired by her strength. "I never thought my story would mean so much to so many people," Michelle said to her father as they sat in the living room. Anthony Carter, always the steady voice of wisdom, replied, "It's because you stood for something bigger than yourself. People see that, and it gives them hope. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's still work to be done." Meanwhile, the police department began implementing the reforms recommended by the Oversight Board. Officers were required to attend mandatory bias training sessions, and a new community engagement program was introduced to rebuild trust. These changes were met with mixed reactions from the police force, but the leadership emphasized that they were necessary for progress. Officer Daniels, now on suspension, had started attending the required training sessions. At first, he was resistant, feeling as though he had been unfairly targeted. But as he listened to the stories of people who had been judged based on appearances, something began to shift within him. One day during a training session, a speaker shared their experience of being stereotyped and the emotional toll it had taken. Daniels found himself reflecting on his actions that day with Michelle. For the first time, he began to understand the impact of his bias, not just on her, but on the trust between the police and the community. While Daniels worked on his own growth, Michelle focused on her mission to create lasting change. She was invited to speak at community events, schools, and even a firefighters convention, where she shared her story and emphasized the importance of understanding and compassion. During one event, a young woman approached Michelle with tears in her eyes. "You don't know me, but your story changed my life," she said. "I used to think I couldn't succeed because of how people judged me. But now, I know I can prove them wrong, just like you did." Michelle hugged the woman, her heart filled with gratitude. These moments reminded her why she had chosen to fight for justice. Back in the city, the reforms were beginning to show results. Community police relations started to improve, with officers and residents working together on neighborhood initiatives. Events like barbecues and cleanup drives brought people together, breaking down the barriers that had caused so much division. Anthony Carter, seeing the progress being made, felt a sense of pride, not just as a father, but as a leader who had dedicated his life to fairness and justice. One evening, he and Michelle took a walk through their neighborhood, where they saw children playing and families enjoying the warm evening air. "This is what it's all about," Anthony said. "Building a future where everyone feels safe and valued." Michelle nodded. "It feels good to know that something positive came out of all this," she said. Despite the progress, Michelle knew there would always be challenges ahead. Change was never easy, and it required constant effort. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. Her father, her colleagues, and her community were all part of the journey. As the night sky lit up with stars, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice and understanding wasn't just her battle. It was a collective mission to create a better, more compassionate world. Months had passed since the hearing, and the city had started to feel the effects of the changes brought about by Michelle Carter's courage and the Oversight Board's decisions. Streets once filled with tension now buzzed with a sense of optimism. Community members and police officers were working together more closely than ever before, building trust and understanding. Michelle, though still deeply committed to her work as a firefighter, found herself stepping into a new role as an advocate for fairness and unity. Invitations to speak at events and workshops poured in, and she balanced these responsibilities with her day-to-day duties at the fire station. One morning, Michelle sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee while reviewing an upcoming speech. She had been invited to speak at a citywide event focused on celebrating diversity and fostering community dialogue. Her father, Anthony Carter, joined her with a proud smile. "You've become quite the role model," he said, setting down a newspaper with Michelle's picture on the front page. The headline read, "Firefighter Sparks Change. How Michelle Carter United a City." Michelle chuckled softly. "I never wanted the spotlight, Dad. I just wanted to do the right thing." "And you did," Anthony replied. "But doing the right thing often inspires others. You've shown people what's possible when we stand up for what we believe in." At the event later that day, Michelle stood on a brightly lit stage before a large crowd. Families, students, community leaders, and even some police officers filled the seats. Michelle spoke with sincerity, sharing her journey and the lessons she had learned. "We are all more than what people see on the surface," she said. "We have stories, dreams, and struggles that make us who we are. When we take the time to understand each other, we create a community where everyone feels valued." The audience erupted in applause. After the event, dozens of people approached Michelle to thank her and share their own stories. Among them was a young man who introduced himself as a new recruit at the fire academy. "I joined because of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I want to be the kind of firefighter who makes a difference, just like you have." Michelle's heart swelled with pride. "You will," she said. "Just remember to always lead with compassion and courage." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was working to rebuild his life and reputation. The training sessions he had attended had opened his eyes to the biases he hadn't even realized he carried. He had reached out to Michelle, apologizing sincerely for his actions and expressing his commitment to change. Though it hadn't been easy, Michelle accepted his apology. "It's not about forgetting what happened," she told him. "It's about moving forward and making sure it doesn't happen again." Daniels had since become a vocal advocate for reform within the police department, working to ensure that his colleagues learned from his mistakes. He often reflected on how Michelle's courage had not only held him accountable, but also pushed him to become a better person. Back at the fire station, Michelle's colleagues celebrated her accomplishments with a small gathering. They presented her with a plaque that read, "To Michelle Carter, a true hero on and off the field." As she looked around at the smiling faces of her friends and teammates, Michelle felt a deep sense of gratitude. Despite the challenges she had faced, she knew she wouldn't have come this far without the support of her community and the unwavering guidance of her father. That evening, Michelle and Anthony sat on the porch of their family home, enjoying the cool breeze and the peaceful sounds of the neighborhood. "You've done something incredible, Michelle," Anthony said. "You turned a moment of pain into a movement of progress." Michelle smiled, leaning back in her chair. "It wasn't just me, Dad. It was all of us. And it's just the beginning." As the stars twinkled above, Michelle felt at peace, knowing that she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for the entire city. The journey had been tough, but it had also been worth every step.